Okay, and back to our lecture, moving on to Greek temples. Um, Again, remember your book has a number of other examples that predate the temple that you see in front of you, which is the Temple of Aphaia at Aegina, which was created somewhere around 500 BCE, 490 BCE. And the reason I've chosen this one rather than looking at some other examples before this is that it is an excellent example of what we call a Doric temple. And it is the last major temple created before a momentous moment in Greece where they defeat the Persians in a story that I'll tell you in a bit. And then things kind of change and they move towards classical aesthetics. And classical aesthetics are things that have stuck around till the present day. So rather than looking at a couple of earlier temples, we'll just look at this one and you can pick up some of the other ideas from your textbook. Now, these temples, of course, are in various states of ruin. They've been around a long time, of course, and most of them are either made out of marble or out of marble plus sandstone that has been covered with a marble type gesso or plaster that then was polished highly to look like marble. And marble is fairly porous, so it doesn't last very well out in the elements. So that's one of the reasons they look the way they do. Almost assuredly, these temples came from originally wooden Templar structures that are based upon the post and lintel system. We can see these posts here. They're what we call columns now. And then at the top, you see the lintel structure. And then above this, just like a contemporary house, there would be a triangular, what's known as a pediment. Now, the thing that's different about these temples and our homes, of course, is that these are religious structures. Every polis had a patron god or goddess associated with that city-state that they paid homage to, who they thought was their protector. And so the temple was much like our contemporary churches. However, for the Greeks, who are, of course, polytheistics, they had many different gods, each associated with a different city-state. By the way, many city-states would have the same protector god or goddess. For instance, there are a number of temples to Zeus. There are a number of temples to Athena. This happens to be a little bit lesser goddess, Aphaia, who is a local goddess of the area. So, what's the temple, right? Well, that temple that you just saw there encloses a sacred space. Temples are areas that we worship our deities, of course, and we would have prayed to them, we would have asked for their help, we would have glorified them, we would have made offerings to them, and so forth. If you look at this floor plan, for instance, the dots that you see around the outside represent columns, and those columns go all the way around these Greek temples. This is what we call a peripteral style. Peri for around, meaning all the way around with our columns. Then, though, there is an inner chamber, the sacred chamber, which, by the way, should look familiar to you from the Megaron structures and even some structures in Crete, where the sacred statue of the goddess, a kind of effigy of the goddess, would have sat. We believe that these were probably made out of wood going back ages and ages, right? It becomes a sacred statue. And so even though you learn the rudiments of stone carving by, let's say, 900 BCE, you probably wouldn't switch that out. You'd stay with the old sacred wooden sculpture, which have since been lost. This would be an area that was only accessible by the elite, meaning full citizens of society or even the priesthood that would have administered to the god or goddess. Every once in a while, this would be open, one believes, to special circumstance visitors, but for the most part, this is a sacred space. The area around the outside, the area covered by the roof underneath these columns, is where everyday type of rituals where other people could join in would be performed. Greece, There are what we call orders of temples. These orders are based upon really strict ratio systems. The Greeks, of course, love mathematical ratios, as you will have read about in your text. And what we mean by an order is a particular style of architecture that comes with some pretty standard forms to it. In front of you is an elevation, an architectural elevation of, on the left-hand side, what is known as a Doric temple. And that Doric temple has very specific components to it. Number one, a Doric temple, and all temples have columns. A Doric temple has a column, but its capital, the thing that tops off the column here, which is made in two parts, you don't need to remember this, is pretty plain, right? It's just a semi-rounded shape with another disc on top. Doric temples as well do not have bases on them. So that's one component of the Doric temple. That's what their columns look like. The columns themselves rest upon a platform, or what's known as a stylobate. All temples have stylobates. Some are fancier than others. Doric temples are pretty austere, pretty simple. Now remember again, you can't switch this around because it's based upon proportions, and the proportions of a column to its capital or the thickness of a column to the size of its capital is essential. So you can't just willy-nilly switch in another order of temple into a Doric temple. And this becomes especially clear if we look at the area above the column. The entire area above the column up into the roof, or what's known as the cornice, is called an entablature. This includes a big crossing member known as a lintel or architrave, and then above that, a series of alternating what are known as triglyphs, which you can remember because there's 3 lines in a row here, and what are known as metopes. Metopes are spaces in between the triglyphs, which sometimes are decorated with sculpture on a Doric temple, and other times are left just plain. What we believe is that these triglyphs probably originated in their design from the ends of pieces of wood that would have been hewn originally in the oldest of temples so as to be the crossing members. And this is like the grain of the wood that then becomes stylized for a marble form. The metopes are just the spaces in between that would have been closed off to keep the weather out, that then became an area for decoration. Up above this is what's known as a cornice. That's just the roof-like form. And the big triangular area that you'll see here underneath what's known as the raking cornice and the regular cornice is what's known as the pediment. That's where the majority of the sculpture, the most important sculpture, usually a sculpture representing the god who is the patron goddess or god of the temple, is housed. If we turn to the right-hand side now, what you see is an example of an Ionic temple. And rather than going through all of the component parts again, let's just note what some of the differences are. Number one, an Ionic temple has as its capital these very characteristic scroll shapes, or what are known as volutes. And they go on all 4 sides of the capital. The columns tend to be more decorative, meaning they tend to be longer, taller, and more fluted. You can see these flutings here, these little indentations. And they have, of course, a base on them that is decorated as well. It's a little bit lighter looking temple, a little bit more elongated. And like the title suggests, Ionic temples originated on the Ionic Islands. Up above this, unlike although it has the same structure as a Doric temple with a lintel form or an architrave, Ionic temples do not have triglyphs and metopes. They have what's known as a frieze. And a frieze is just simply a band of relief sculpture that extends all the way across this zone, usually on all 4 sides of the temple. And then again, in this area, underneath in the cornice and what's known as the pediment would be the major sculpture of the temple itself. Let's look at an example of a reconstruction of the Temple of Aphaia at Aegina. What we can see here is the peripteral form of the Doric columns all the way around. We can see up above this the entablature, the area from the top of the capital to the bottom of the cornice. And here we see the triglyphs and the metopes, which are not decorated in this case. Up above that, you see the area of the pediment, which you can see a sculpture here that we'll see in a bit that would have filled this zone. And then you can also get a sense of the way it's constructed with other columns holding up the roof and the inner cella or interior, very religious chamber being closed off from the external part of the temple itself. As I said, the major place for sculpture on these types of temples is in the pediment. And that pediment is this triangular space underneath the cornice in which the sculptures are housed. Now, at the Temple of Aphia and Aegina, we see some pretty creative ways of dealing with what is a difficult space to house sculpture in. In other words, in earlier temples, you would have in the center, as we do here, the major goddess associated with this temple. In this case, it's not probably Aphia, although it might have been on one of the sides. It's more likely to be Athena, because the scene that we're seeing here is a scene of the participants of the local culture in the Trojan Wars and battle scenes going on in which Trojans are killed off by Greek soldiers right and left. The creative part is that notice how in these corners, and if I go down here to, this is a reconstruction, obviously at the top. If I go down to the extant sculptures that are still around here, you can see that kneeling figures, such as this, exist in the space as it gets smaller, and then fallen warriors exist in these little tiny areas at the end of the pediment so as to make use of that space. And this is quite creative. What we also see in this temple, if you look closer on these figures, is that while they still remain somewhat archaic looking, we are moving towards a little bit more degree of naturalism. That will totally change to high degrees of naturalism tempered with a ton of idealism after 480 BCE, after the Greeks' triumph over the Persians, and humanism and idealism really develop in Greek classical culture. This is something that's a little disconcerting to a lot of students to learn. All of those white temples and white sculptures that we're so familiar with were actually at one point richly painted. The only part of the body that wasn't painted was the nude form, but all forms of clothing, all spears, all headdresses, weaponry, shields, these were all painted, and not minor colors, right? As you see here, they were painted yellows and blues and reds to really stand out. Getting up close here, what you're looking at is a figure of a fallen warrior from the corner of the pediment at the Temple of Aphia. And what we're starting to notice, if you think back to those painted forms, what we're starting to notice is a much more careful attention to the anatomy of a real figure, right? You wouldn't have seen this in ancient Greek. You don't see it in Mycenaean culture. You don't see it even in Minoan culture, and you certainly don't see this attention to the realism of a body that's been posed here from Egyptian culture, which is probably where the Greeks learned how to carve marble in the first place. The thing that remains very archaic looking, meaning it looks stylized, it doesn't look like a real face, is the head of the figure. Other things are starting to show some degree of anatomy, some interest in the human body. The back of that form as well, just so you can see the attention that was paid to a fairly naturalistic rendition of the human body. And this is on the other side, a fallen warrior as well, and many of the same characteristics remain true. I will just draw our attention to one thing that is, or a couple things that are really notable. When a hand rests upon something and is being strained, we do get these muscles and tendons jumping out of the forearm, which we see here. And the same thing is going on as he tries to kind of push himself up. You see the musculature on the leg showing that strain. These, again, these interests in our world and the way things really look in our world. And as we'll see, that coupled with an interest in the perfect, in creating the most ideal form, are hallmarks of the Greek classical tradition. Speaking of Very briefly, you will read the Greeks have created freestanding sculptures since about 800 BCE, and you don't need to remember the names of these figures, but these are all what are known as Koray figures. Koray, Kore, is the name for any female figure. It basically means youthful girl in Greek times. And you can see on the far left of your screen the Egyptian sculpture that we looked at. That's clearly in some ways the kind of starting point for Greeks. The Greeks were trading with the Egyptians since Minoan times, as you know. They probably would have picked up the rudiments of marble carving from them and then transferred it to their own works. In the middle is the oldest of these Koray forms, a figure that's in dress. Most, of course, Greek figures of women are completely clothed up until about the middle of the fourth century BCE, because that's the way Greek society worked. Undress was oftentimes associated with lower classes, except for men and athletes. So the women are all clothed and they're very stylized. They look very, plainer, as if you can imagine the block of marble that they were carved out of, which looks a lot like, again, if you look at these feet, like the Egyptian sculptures. They don't show a lot of movement. They don't seem to be very specific to a particular human being, meaning like a portrait. And what we believe most of these represented were votive figures to the goddesses, meaning a sculpture that could be placed either in the temple or on the walk up to the temple as a kind of enduring prayer for the goddess, or sometimes they represent goddesses themselves, or, and don't be shocked by this, but with all the emphasis on men in Greek culture, there were women athletes and women warriors. And we know that the male forms oftentimes represent these, and there is a belief that some of the women figure could represent not just goddesses, but heroes, women heroes or women athletes. In time, these forms progress. This is the middle one, the most Koray, as she's known, to show you how she is just completely kind of straight up and down, very rigid. You see the arm that is broken off here that would have been offering something up, we believe, and the very stylized face that just looks like, a very kind of schematic of a face, no particular individual yet. The places that you see holes in this would have actually been adorned by real jewelry in order to enliven the sculpture. As time goes forward, they get fancier and fancier, and they get more and more kind of realistic. If you look at this later Koray figure, who's wearing a slightly different garb here, one associated with the priesthood or frankly with a goddess, you can actually start to see more of the body underneath this figure, and that's a very slow charted course, right? In 800, they look a particular way. 300 years later, they still look much the same way until around 480 when something big happens. In terms of the male form, although of course the male form are always nude, or not most of the time they're nude, and the male form are known as what are called as Kouros figures, Kouros. It just simply means youthful male again. Clearly comes from the tradition of the Egyptians, as you can see in this comparison with an Egyptian sculpture on the left and a Greek sculpture over on the right. Show a lot of movement, and over the course of hundreds of years, there are very few changes in these sculptures. They can be created out of marble, terracotta, which is a low-fired clay, but they remain much the same. There's a slight, just like the Egyptian sculptures, one foot is in front of the other, but the shoulders are straight back. There's a little bit more emphasis on actual musculature than you see in Egyptian sculpture, but this characteristic kind of shin bone thing that we've got going on here, the really sharp edge to that, clearly comes right out of Egyptian sculpture where they no doubt learned their trade. And these are Greek heroes, Greek gods, great athletes, and so forth. They tend not to represent particular human beings, although there is some evidence that great athletes were sometimes carved. So, short, if you look from the left to the right, you see the development of the Kouros form from a very, very schematic form around 800 BCE all the way up to the second to the right, minor changes over the course of hundreds of years. And then in 480 BCE, because of some major changes in the Greek world, we get this form over here known as the Kouros boy, in which things get incredibly lifelike, but it's a lifelike that is idealized. And that's the key to Greek sculpture and, frankly, Greek temples and everything Greek. They're interested in the ideal. What happened? The Kouros boy, found on the Acropolis, created, we believe, somewhere around 480 BCE due to the stratigraphy in the area and what was buried alongside of it. This is what happened. All the way up until 490 BCE, the Greek city-states were more or less aligned, but they weren't a unit until, because of the threat of the Persian Empire, who was basically charging them taxes to leave them alone. And in particular, the Persian Empire had taken over a number of the Ionian islands. The Greeks decide to fight back, and in a famous battle in which the Persians come into town and kind of march right through the Greek mainland and up to an area known as Marathon, the Greeks, with a very small group of warriors, defeat a group of 10,000 Persians. This is huge. The big kid on the block at this stage is the Persian Empire, and the Greeks have defeated them. It was, and by the way, if you're wondering, yes, marathon, that story where we get the term marathon for a race comes from this story. The story has it that the man who was in charge of alerting Athens to the victory or the defeat ran all the way from Marathon to Athens to deliver the news, a little over 26 miles, and then collapsed dead, supposedly, according to the story, which may or may not be true. In any case, what this starts then is a new culture in Greece. The Greek city-states, knowing that the Persians are likely to return once they've regathered their troops and deal with some things over in Persia, band together. They start what is known as the Delian League. The Delian League is centered in Athens, in the area known as Attica, and it controls is the wrong word, but it's kind of the figurehead for all of Greece, including the nations of Sparta, the nations of the north, the Ionic Islands, and so forth. And they basically create an agreement to band together to develop more weaponry, to train forces. They develop the idea of being Greek as a culture rather than a bunch of disparate city-states. Now, they're still individual city-states, but they're banded together around this idea. The other thing that comes from this event is that the Greeks began to really develop ideas that have become known as humanism. Humanism is a deep interest in our world and in making humankind the best that it can be, both through, for the Greeks, philosophy, the sciences, mathematics, geometry, philosophy, the arts, and so on. They wanted to perfect themselves. They were fairly egotistical. They thought they were better than anyone else already, but they wanted to perfect themselves, and they thought that the gods wanted them to perfect themselves. And this leads to another question when we're looking at something like the Kouros boy and thinking about Greek sculpture, which is, how did the Greeks conceive of their gods and their world in relation to their gods? And I'll pick this up again, but the kind of simple story is that the Greeks believed that their gods up on Mount Olympus were the most enduring, timeless, universal, fantastic, entities ever, and that their world was in some way almost like a shadow play of what the gods were doing up on Mount Olympus. If the gods got in fights, they might take it out on human beings. If the gods had petty jealousies, maybe that showed up in the real world. If things were going well for the gods, things would go well on earth. And the best that one could try to be underneath this humanistic idea was as close to the gods as you could be, emulating their greatest qualities. But the other thing to say about the Greek gods is that they are not personifications of celestial bodies. They're not all perfect. The Greek gods, in some very important ways, are exactly like humans, except better and sometimes even worse. They are exemplars for the most extraordinary accomplishments, but they also do some pretty questionable things morally and get caught up in their own emotions and so forth, which the Greeks took as examples to learn from. So for instance, when Zeus, and you would never imagine this happening in any other culture's religion at this time, when Zeus decides he is going to seduce a beautiful maiden, and the repercussions for that are huge. His wife finds out and she hates him and she does this to so and the woman gets pregnant, which upsets her marriage and leads to this and that. What the Greeks take from that is a story in which the excess of Zeus, his overwhelming sexual urges, lead to problems that they can learn by. So, in 490, the Greeks win against the Persians in Marathon. But a lot of the Greek major temples have been destroyed before that final battle takes place. They come back to their cities and they've established the Delian League. And 10 years later, in 480 BCE, the Persians show up again, this time with a much bigger force, but the Greeks are ready for them. And while the Persians march right through Athens and basically destroy the Acropolis, which is the big old Mycenaean city, by the way, but at this time, the modern kind of center of Athens, they end up losing, the Persians do, at a famous battle in Salamis, where the Greeks once again are triumphant over the Persians and will kick them out until the time of Alexander the Great, in which case Alexander takes the battle to them. Right from that moment forward, the Greek style changes dramatically towards things that we see like this. One of the things that is so new about the Kouros boy is that it looks incredibly naturalistic. In other words, instead of looking planar and looking like a figure that is bright marble, you can just see the column that it's carved out of, that doesn't seem to have any movement whatsoever, whose face looks schematic as well. The Kouros boy looks like a real boy, right? He's got what's called contrapposto pose. That's that characteristic weight shift that you see in sculptures where they lean back on one hip so as to articulate the body. If you try this, if you stand up and kind of shift back onto one hip, you'll notice that one side of your body will be what's called engaged. In this case, the standing leg is engaged with all the muscles tight, while the other leg, of course, is free. In the body, that sets up opposing forces. The actual engaged part of the upper body, in order to counterbalance this, is the left-hand side of this body to us, while the right-hand side is free. This gives it some naturalism. As well, the face, including the eyes, which would have been inlaid, starts to look more real. But this is where we need to pause again. Greek sculptures, while they look natural, while they look like real human beings, are ideals. They are all created out of canons of proportions, right? Like we saw back with the Egyptians. Although for the Greeks, their canons of proportions are a lot more complicated. One of the standard units of a canon of proportion, for instance, is the distance between the end of a finger and its first digit relative to the entire length of the finger. Now, this distance, or this ratio, is a little bit over 3 to 1. There are 3 of this length to the entire length of the finger. And they would create that same ratio through all the fingers. They would create a very similar ratio between the tip of the finger and the edge of the palm, 1 unit of this to the entire length of the arm, and so on and so forth, so that the entire body is generated out of these perfect proportions. We'll get to why in a moment here. From the back, if you remember the other ones, they're just straight up and down, but this one kind of tilts back, shows that engaged leg, shows something that looks a heck of a lot more naturalistic, but we know it's idealistic. This is what most Greek sculptures originally looked like. This is one of the Rhiachi warriors. The Rhiachi warriors were sculptures made out of bronze, out of the lost wax casting method, that were found preserved at the bottom of the ocean during the 20th century. Believe it or not, most of the sculptures that you'll see in this lecture and that you see in museums, which are labeled Greek, are actually Roman copies after Greek originals. And most of those Greek originals were made out of bronze. Not all, but a lot of them were bronze sculptures. Bronze is a precious material, and frankly, anytime someone came across earlier sculptures, they oftentimes would just melt them down to use that metal for something else. Or during more Christian times, Christians seeing these as false idols, as sculptures devoted to other gods than their own, would destroy these. So there are very few bronze sculptures around, which is why this one's so special for us. In the sculpture, again, all created out of the lost wax casting method, we see once again the perfect Greek ideal. This is a Greek saying something like, the closest things to the gods are our heroes, are people that are in the image of the gods. And the way that we create a sculpture in the image of the god is to make them perfect in all of their proportions and all of, every way that we can. Because when someone comes in contact with the ideal on earth, they will come in contact with the realm of the gods. Now, these sculptures probably, again, served as votive offerings or representations of heroes or even gods in the Templar districts of the culture. Let's get up closer on this figure. This lost wax casting, again, you can probably see this. There are different materials used for the nipples of this figure, his lips and his eyes, which also probably had crystal inserts in them. Every single detail that you see in here was, of course, carved into the surface of wax that was overlaid a piece of, a human scale figured piece of plaster and then sandwiched under another layer of plaster to create that hollow form bronze. This is the Riachi Warrior A from the back. You can see what he looks like. He probably held in his hand at one point a spear with a shield on that arm. You can see this over here. Very, again, contrapposto pose, that characteristic weight shift onto one body leg. Idealism, right? It looks natural, but it's ideal. The idea is to create a human form out of sculpture that will mimic the realm of the gods. Most famous of the old Greek sculptures, which was actually carved in marble, is the figure you see to the left by the great sculptor Polykleitos, and it's known as the Doryphoros, or spear bearer. This, like most marble carvings, unless they come off of a building, is a Roman copy of a Greek original. And if you're looking at your lecture guide, you'll see RC for Roman copy after a lot of originals. The original in this case was bronze, although Polykleitos sculpted in marble as well, and probably originally created one of these in marble as well. So what's so special about this? Well, it's the perfect example of what the Greeks were up to with their sculptures. This is almost like a visual example of what was known as these canons of proportions, but the Greeks called the perfect ratio or commensurability of one part to the other, tip of a finger to the whole finger, the hand to the arm, the foot to the leg, and so forth. Number of heads to a body, which is about 7 heads to the body. They called this, they gave this the term symmetria for a perfect commensurability of the parts. And what you're looking at here is a Roman text that describes this canon of proportions by Galen, the 2nd century Roman physician, who says, quote, beauty, Chrysippus believes, inheres in the commensurability of the parts, such as that of a finger to finger and all these to the palm and wrist, and these to the forearm and the forearm to the upper arm and everything to everything else, just as it is written in the canon of Polykleitos. Polykleitos apparently wrote down these measurements at some point. For having taught us in that treatise all the commensurate proportions of the body, Polykleitos made a work to support his account. He made a statue according to the tenets of his writing and called it, like the treatise, the canon. Now, we believe that this work, the Doriferos, is Akkadian. Where things get really interesting. Think a little bit about the contemporary philosophy of the time. When we start thinking about what ideals mean, we can get a little bit further on this question of why they were so interested in creating the ideal. So some of you will remember, and I'm sure everyone knows the name Plato from your old history lessons. And Plato, of course, was one of the most important classical philosophers of his age, someone who learned from Socrates and will have a huge influence on the later Aristotle. Plato believed that that the world that we lived in, the world that we sense, the world that we exist in, was actually an imperfect reflection of a more perfect realm that he called the realm of forms, or the realm of the eidos. He believed that the world we lived in was kind of an imperfect reflection of this more perfect realm of forms, and it might help you, although he wasn't really thinking in these terms, of that old idea that the Greek gods up on Mount Olympus are kind of the perfect realm, and our realm is almost like a shadow play of that realm up there in Mount Olympus. Or another way to put this is to say that for Plato, in this realm around us, you might come across things that are beautiful or that you think are beautiful, but that's just a subjective beauty, a beauty that is subject to your senses, and you might argue with a friend over whether this is beautiful or that is beautiful. And for Plato, that's because it's an imperfect reflection of true beauty, a beauty that exists in the realm of forms, the kind of conceptual realm that is only partially reflected here in this world. The importance of this idea is that for the Greeks, there is an order in the universe. There is perfection in the universe. It's what they call the cosmos. It's ordered, it's regular, it's ruled by and governed by principles, but we don't necessarily see these principles in our everyday world because this world is an imperfect reflection of that. We oftentimes come across what the Greeks called chaos, the way that things don't seem to follow a regular pattern and so forth. The Greeks then, and Plato in particular, believed that art's job, if it was to be worth anything at all, was not to reflect the way that the world looked around us. He called that mimetic art. You see this at the bottom. Mimetic art was an imperfect reflection of something already in this world that was already imperfect. So it basically took you two removes away from the realm of perfection. What Plato wanted and what these Greek artists wanted was to create forms, in this case, the beautiful male form, that was ideal because that would be a manifestation of the realm of forms, the realm of universal, timeless, transcendent concepts that were true for all time, in all places, and for all people. They would be creating beauty with a capital B rather than just a small b beauty in this world that was subject to change and so forth. So the Greeks are about creating perfect beauty, or the ideal, because it will lift us into higher contemplation of universal timeless values. Not something that's subject to change, but something that remains the same for all time. Another component of Greek philosophy, a big one, is that truth and beauty and goodness, what's called the Platonic triangle, are all one and the same thing. You cannot have truth without it being beautiful and without it being good. Or another way to put this is, if you create a beautiful sculpture, it will also be imbued with truth and goodness. It has a moral dimension. It has a knowledge dimension to it. Beauty is not just beauty to entertain our senses. It's a manifestation of truth and goodness at the same time. Goodness is what the Greeks called arete, or the excellence or virtue of the moral dimension. Truth, of course, the timeless realm of forms, and beauty is the ideal form that these all take. And back to canon of Hermes, or what it's called the Doriferos. If you were to measure this out then, you would see, for instance, the ideal being formed out of perfect symmetry, right? Both sides exactly the same. That's a key component of symmetria, the commensurability of parts. you would see a balancing of rhythm, what the Greeks call rhythmos, one arm up, one arm down, one foot or leg engaged, the other leg free, one side of the body free, the other side engaged, and so forth. You also see the perfect relation of parts to a whole, the distance between a finger to the entire finger and the hand to the arm and forearm and so forth. That's all very logically and mathematically worked out to create the perfect form. And finally, there are exactly 7 heads to the entire body in this form to create that ideal. This ideal in the realm of sculpture was, of course, something that humans wanted to try to strive to be themselves. That is the humanistic spirit. The other thing to say about this is if we back up again and look at that face one more time, you'll notice Greek classical sculptures, and this is right smack of the classical age, right? This figure, Doryphoros, was created around 450 to 440 BCE. Greek faces at this time are totally stoic, what we call filled with ethos rather than pathos. It's the idea of, that comes from Plato as well, that you need to control your emotions because your emotions get in the way of rational thought, of being a rational person. And so they show this kind of calm in them, or what the Greeks called ethos. Now, to show you a number of other copies of the same sculpture from Roman times, because there have been found no less than 40 sculptures that seem to have been based upon the Greek original. Bronze sculpture here, just to show you these. Again, cire perdu or lost wax casting, probably of Zeus or Poseidon from around the same time period as the Doryphoros, again based upon perfect proportions. This sculpture was probably originally holding in his hand a spear or a trident that he was getting ready to throw. And a little bit later, by Myron, called Discobolos, which is another of those Roman copies of a Greek original. In this case, a sculpture of a figure in movement associated with the Olympic Games and with athletics. The Greeks were very interested in not only perfecting the mind, but perfecting the body, and feats of athletics not only fed into a culture that was, of course, worried about the Persians coming back, but in the kind of competitive spirit that we have even today. The Olympics, of course, go all the way back to ancient Greek times, well before the classical period, to 776 BCE. So we see a figure here getting ready to throw a discus, and we see in particular the Greek notion of rhythmos, one movement showing the entire series of movements that will unfold from this moment forward. The figure is once again created in perfect ideal. It looks totally realistic, but remember, realism is the idea that something would be based upon an actual figure. So a better term would be naturalistic, except that even though this looks like a real figure that it may not be an exact copy of, we know that the proper term for this is idealistic. It's the perfect representation of the male form, like a god on earth, but in marble. Look at this from different angles, you'll see this rhythmos gives you an idea of one movement leading to many other movements. Move forward in time a bit, we get to what's known as the late classical period. This is a work by the great sculptor Praxiteles that is known as Hermes with the infant Dionysus. Hermes is the messenger god. He's the god you usually see with an Adusis, that symbol of the Surgeon General in US culture that has a staff with 2 snakes intertwining around it. His job is usually to go off to see heroes and basically tell them something that the other big gods want that hero to know. In this case, it's a kind of teasing gesture. The young Dionysus, who's the god of wine, the god of revelry, the god of kind of excess, is being tempted, we believe originally, by Hermes holding up in front of him a bundle of grapes that he's reaching out for. The big reason to show you this is not only to say, here's one that we know is the representation of a god, but to show you some of the evolution or changes that occurred over the course of 100 years or so of sculpture. Hermes shows a little bit more facial expression, for instance, than we saw in the classical sculptures. These late classical sculptures oftentimes show a little bit more. You can also see the big sway of the body, right? A big contrapposto here leaning into him and holding that arm away from him. More movement was a part of the late classical tradition as well. They're still incredibly ideal, and this is, of course, a Roman copy of a Greek original, but some things do change from the earlier sculptures over time. Some emotion on the face, and I don't know if you can see this, but the face of Dionysus is he's getting pretty frustrated by not being able to get those grapes. Sculpture from the late period, in this case by the sculptor Lysippus, from around 330 BCE, right on the tail, the beginnings of the so-called Hellenistic period, is a work called the EPOXI Menace, or the oil scraper. This is, again, an idealized sculpture. In this case, we've got a much more elongated form than we had earlier on. This may have to do with where it was originally set. And what he's doing, just very briefly, is he's an athlete, and one of the ways that athletes clean themselves, in fact, Greeks cleaned themselves, was to cover themselves in olive oil, and then to scrape it off with something known as a strigil, which is just a kind of hooked, it almost looks like a shoehorn. They could just strip the oil and with it all the dirt and sweat off your body, and apparently it would be, I don't know, moisturized by the olive oil as well. So looking at this a little bit again, elongated heads to the body here, as are the legs, a little bit skinnier, and arms, and it reaches out into your space in a way the earliest classical sculptures do not. Pause here for a minute, and then we'll come back with a brief survey of the development of the female form towards the famous Aphrodite of Cnidus, and we'll finish the lecture moving through the Parthenon and Hellenistic sculptures.